So welcome everyone. I'm going to talk today about how we went from WordPress to an Umbraco powered platform. This is our index. We're going to do a little introduction, talk about the problem, the solution that we came up with, the approach that we took, and then obviously something about the architecture. First things first, who am I? You've seen me throughout the day, but I didn't actually introduce myself just yet. My name is Lennard Fonteijn. I'm a CTO at Ireland at part of 4NG. I'm doing that part-time. I'm also a lecturer at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. I do that 2 days a week, and it's a really fun balance for me to do both of these things at the same time. I've been working with Umbraco since version 4. So that's quite a long time. I think it's about 10 years so far. Any other info, I'm an Umbraco MVP, I'm an Umbraco master, I'm a e-commerce MVP, and I'm also a nocturnal animal. So just to give an example, I made the final touches on this PowerPoint, I think last night at 2:30 or something. So what was exactly our problem? Well, first, a little bit of information about 4NG. 4NG is a group of labels. So as you can see, it's Nextfields, Fornet, Netflix, Arlenet, Possibility, Brain Brothers, and obviously some new ones in the future coming as well, probably. And they all had their own website, which is fine. I mean, every company needs a website, but there was a big problem with those websites, and that is that they were based on WordPress. Well, obviously, a website on WordPress isn't the end of the world, even though we really like Umbraco. But we really needed something to be able to build a platform. So using WordPress as a base just wasn't going to cut it for us. So what was our actual problem besides the websites being WordPress? Well, the problem is that we have 6 labels, and there's a lot of knowledge going around. And with new labels coming in the future, we're only going to be spreading out that knowledge. So it's very important for our employees to be able to find each other, share knowledge with each other, let each other know what we're doing when it comes to cases, clients, employees, and that sort of thing. So we had to make something which made it possible for us to share all this information, gather it, as well as show it to people. So what was our solution in that? And we divided that in 3 different sections. So there's the problem of collecting the data, there's the problem of being able to share the data, and there's the problem of propagating that data. And we divided those 3 things into something we call the matrix, the knowledge base, and the corporate website. And the purpose of the matrix is to collect and process the data that we have, as well as store that in a normalized fashion. So that means that if we have something about an employee, that all employees have the same data in the same form. I mean, we really like normalized data. The knowledge base was meant to be able to share the data. So we collected all the data about employees, about projects, about cases, that sort of stuff. So we need a way to share those with our employees. So that's where the knowledge base came from. And last but not least, we also had the corporate website. So the idea is that we have a corporate website with a lot of content. But usually what happens is that you have a content page about Umbraco. Umbraco has a Umbraco logo on top of it. You have a page about WordPress. Maybe you have a page about Episerver or Optimizely. And from one day to another, Episerver announces that they're renaming themselves to Optimizely, which means you have to update all your content from Episerver to Optimizely. You have to update the logos and that sort of stuff. So we really wanted to do something smart with the corporate website, which allowed us to get the data from the matrix and show that data on the website, which means that if you want to show a listing of technologies that we're using, that the matrix is going to tell us which logos to use, how we have to call that technology, where we have to link to page-wise. So we wanted to make the corporate website all about content, but anything that we could automatically get from the matrix, we should be able to get from the matrix. So that was the general solution that we thought was best. So we had a few requirements for all of these platforms. There's the matrix, and we figured, okay, so if we're talking about employees and cases and projects, partnerships, all those kind of things, we're really talking about entities. Everything is an entity. Entity contains data, and data can be normalized. Another requirement we thought was really important was the fact that it should be no code. And I personally really don't like that word, but it is what it is. And it just meant that everyone should be able to extend the matrix with new data and entities without needing a developer to do so. We also wanted it to be fully headless. So you have to imagine that with all that data, we should be able to hook up different platforms in order to actually consume that data without relying on any type of technology to do so. For the matrix, we also decided that we really wanted to use Umbraco. And we wanted to use Umbraco because we really like the out-of-the-box editorial experience. We can have property editors, we can have block lists, we can have all kinds of things. We just cut off the front end and we still have a very nice CMS to do all our stuff. So that was the requirements for the matrix for us. Next up, there's the knowledge base. And there were a few requirements for that one as well. We really wanted something like user roles. You have to imagine that we're going to store a lot of data in the matrix, and not all of that data is as relevant for all employees. So we want to be able to make a distinction between the different kind of users and show them the data that's relevant to them or that they're even allowed to see. You can imagine that for projects, for example, we're going to register a budget that was used for that project, which is something of an interesting data point for maybe CTOs, CEOs, and that sort of things. But most employees shouldn't have to know how much money was spent on a project. Employees should also be able to find other employees so they can know who they have to contact if they have questions about certain problems. And because we wanted to make it possible for employees to search other employees, we also had to add something like a search engine. And the search engine should allow us to, basically find anything that's in the matrix. And we also decided on making this based on Vue.js, or a single page application. We could have used Angular, we could have used React. It didn't really matter as long as we had something that we could use as a single page application just to show that the matrix could work in a fully headless way. And last up, there was the corporate website. And obviously, as I mentioned in the beginning, it was the idea to have one platform to rule them all. All labels that are part of 4NG should be able to get a website on this. It should also be able to be used for landing pages on certain projects and that sort of thing. And they should all be based on the same technology stack. It should also be integrated with the matrix because, as I said, we want to pull as much data from the matrix as we possibly could. It should also be SEO optimized as well as a great performance right out of the box. So during development, we're constantly measuring how are we doing with this so that every website that we're hosting on this platform has a great out-of-the-box experience when it comes to the performance and the SEO. And for this one, we obviously also decided on using Umbraco because we knew already that we wanted to integrate something like Marketing Suite at some point. Yay. So how did we do all this? How do we went from 5+ websites to a platform with all these different kinds of systems? Well, at 4NG, we usually have a path we go through to do all these kind of things. So it's the strategy, the concepting, then there's the UX UI phase, there's the development, and then you start filling up the website and you start optimizing it. So that's a usual approach. we already discussed the strategy so far. So I already told you what our solution was, how we want to do that. So let's dive into the UX UI design, how we approach that. So you've seen this slide before. Lots of different websites, somewhat similar, but also a lot of different components. One side really liked to use tiles, the other one you like to use cards. The one had big headers, the other one didn't. Then there was the Islandnet website, which was completely designed differently because we weren't part of 4NG for very long at that time. So we went through all of these websites and basically just make one great document. And sorry, we wrote it in Dutch, so this is the best I could show. And we went through all the websites and basically noted down every piece of component we could see. So logos, the pages, what's on those pages, what kind of interaction, what kind of call to actions, that sort of stuff. And we did that for all these websites. Once we had all those components written down, we could start mixing and matching them. Which ones do we use the most? Which one is used the least? So we could trim the amount of components and start mocking up a design. So we used Adobe XD for that. We just took a lot of screenshots from all the old websites and just basically started moving around all those components into a single design. So what you're seeing here is only a handful of the pages that we made. I think we made maybe 30, 35 pages or something, just to give an impression of what we could make with all the components that we found so far and which we basically redesigned a little. Obviously, we also validated this with the stakeholders because 4NG itself was the stakeholder. So we had regular sessions to also talk about what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. For the knowledge base, we did a similar thing, but other than already having our own websites, we had to look around for new ones. So we started looking for websites that had a search-focused, filtering-focused aim. And we found a few very nice ones. So, for example, the Epicurious, about all things about food and recipes. I personally really like Tweakers from a search and filtering perspective. And we found some templates that did listings of data with filters and that sort of stuff. So we really like these, and we started basically going through the same phase. So this is one of the many mockups that we made. And eventually we settled on something like this. So there's obviously the default. There's the logo on the top right. There's the filters or the menus on the left. And then there's the full section in the middle where all the data is going to be presented. And we gave that to a designer, and he turned that into this for us. So that was basically how our design came to be. Obviously for the matrix, because it's headless, there's no front end, so we didn't have to design anything for the matrix. So let's talk about the development. I'm going through a few steps here. So the matrix is probably the most interesting bit of everything I'm going to show you today, which I'm going to elaborately talk about at the end during the architectural phase. So for now, if you think about the corporate website for now, it's mostly content. And when we're making a content website, we usually use something like a grid or block list or whatever. So we took most of these components that we found during one of the concepting phases and trimmed them down to a little set of components that we could reuse. And our policy in here is always less is more. So the least amount of components you can find, the better. Because you don't really need a header and a header that does a paragraph as well. So you can just componize, they're called components. So you can make a page out of different components. So one of our, probably the best example of our component in here is the card row. And the card row is pretty much a component based on other components. It has a header component in it. It can render content with all kinds of different, let me put on my laser pointer. It can render things in all kinds of different ways. So it's a fully dynamic thing. So it's a single component, but depending on what you pick, it knows how to render it. If you pick a case, it knows how to render a case. If you pick a default content page, it will turn it into a link. So it's pretty dynamic depending on how you use it. And it also served as a pretty nice base for the matrix later on. But we'll, as I said, we'll get to that. Then there was the matrix itself, and this is also where things got a little out of hand, because we set the bar rather high for us. Where we said we don't want an editor to be able to edit stuff. There's going to be no front end. There's going to be a dynamic entity, so nothing is static. And usually when you're making a website, it's very nice to have something like a models builder, where you have static types and you can make an API out of static types. For the matrix, there was none of that. So we struggled a little with this, but eventually we settled on this structure. So, for example, there's cases, certifications, customers, employees on the left. Each on its own is a list view, which contains other entities to describe what they are and what they should and shouldn't do. We'll get to how this technically works later on, but with the design and at least the technical design of the matrix out of the way, we could talk about how we wanted to do the knowledge base. And yeah, so this is an example of how the knowledge base looks like today. So let's talk about the approach and the content optimization. So pretty much after the knowledge base, the development was done, and you go into the optimization, the content and the optimization phase of our process. So this is a screenshot of our corporate website right now. So if you go to 4ng.nl, you will find these pages at some. And as you can see on the left, there's a lot of icons in here. It's something like a list overview of icons. And we're very proud to say that all of this data is coming straight out of the matrix. The website has no idea what it's rendering or how it's doing it. The matrix is telling it to render this in one way or another. And the same goes for the cases and the sliders here on the left. The matrix just tells it, hey, we have these amount of cases for designing technology. We have these cases for data and performance. Render them. The website really has no idea what it's showing, just that it's something out of the matrix and that it should show it as a card row. So that's really cool. And as you can see for the knowledge base, another screenshot. It also knows that for certain cases, there are cases published on the website, so it's a two-way kind of thing. Even though the matrix is the one in charge of all the data, the knowledge base and the corporate website also have a connection in order to actually exchange the information about what kind of cases are published. So with all that work out of the way, let's talk about architecture, because that's probably the most interesting thing to talk about. And before I do, let's talk about things that didn't work for us. The first thing that didn't work for us was the block list. So we decided on trying initially to build everything from a block list and blocks and that sort of stuff. We also call them Ditto objects. The idea was that you could have a block list, combine it with all kinds of blocks, and the blocks together would form the entity. So if you have an employee, you could give the employee a certification, and you could give an employee a name, and you could give him a personal website and that sort of stuff. So pretty much every entity would be a block list. But it turned out that at some point we started rebuilding the Umbraco property editors and the Umbraco doc type system. So we went back to the drawing board, and after a lot of discussion, we settled on, okay, why not just let the content, or at least the admins that are going to manage all this data, why not just give them access to the settings, give them access to the doc types, and let them build dot tags. So you can use the system that Umbraco already has for us in place. So the benefit of that, obviously, is we can make custom property editors, we can hook them up, we have all the events in Umbraco to extend all this logic. So why not? Obviously, the downside of this is that editors could also break stuff pretty easily because it's a very powerful section. But we thought, okay, but if we have regular updates, we give some training, make proper documentation, why not? Let's just go with it. So it was an accepted risk, and this was our new Ditto. So then next up was the API. How are we going to serve all this dynamic data to whatever we want to share it with? And the first thing that came to mind was GraphQL. And I actually got pretty far hooking up the GraphQL. You can generate a schema. The schema lets the website know what kind of fields are there. There's a GraphQL language to get the data that you want. But the problem was that at some point I needed more data about the schema than the specification of GraphQL allowed me to do. On top of that, I was also a bit annoyed that I had to constantly make all kinds of mutators and data poolers and what you would call it, to grab data from the data sources and serve it in a GraphQL-like way. So at some point we just had to decide that GraphQL was no longer the go. So we went for, next up we went for OData. And OData is a Microsoft package, it's an open specification. And I also got a proof of concept running with that. But the problem with the .NET library of OData is that it really favors static typed models, which we didn't have in the matrix. We had dynamic typed. And while you can have dynamic typed things, the API is not that great. So I mean, from a technical perspective, the API of using OData with dynamic models. And on top of that, I pretty much had to re-implement the full logic of filtering and expanding data myself. So I was already struggling using something that I really wanted to use, but it didn't let me use it properly. And then I also had to pretty much reinvent the wheel in order to keep using it. So we decided to drop OData as well. But that leaves the question, what then? If not GraphQL, what if not OData? What then? Well, it turned out we just had to make it ourselves. And that might seem a little odd. I mean, there's all kinds of API stacks out there, why not use them? But our use case here was so specific that it just in the end gave us a lot more benefit of building it ourselves than using something that other people already thought of. So we made an API that could do two things, and one of the things that didn't work out for GraphQL was actually rather easy for our own one, and that was generating a schema of all the data that's in the matrix. So as you can see here in the result, I asked for a schema of all the entities in the matrix, and it tells me that an employee has a first name, has a last name, has a date of birth, and that sort of thing, with all kinds of descriptions and metadata that GraphQL didn't allow me to add as part of my response of the schema. So then next up was selecting data. Okay, so I know the schema, I know how my data looks. I want to pull it out. And because I already had to reinvent the wheel if I wanted to use OData, I could just as well rewrite this and make it happen from scratch. So a little word of warning, this is not easy material. You need quite some knowledge about how compiling programming languages works in general in order to actually be able to grab a piece of text and turn it into something that you can interpret and change into working code. So in the screenshot you can see one of my unit tests that I built for my specification, and it turned out to be a little bit of a mix between GraphQL and OData. So it's it's a rather simple syntax, but you can have a comma-separated list of the fields of an entity you're interested in. So as you just saw, our employee has a first name, last name. These are the aliases of those. So I could, for example, say, okay, give me the first name and the last name. Sorry, well, you're waving at me for 50 minutes, but I had 45, right? I'm already at half an hour now. Huh? Oh, okay. Sorry for that. Yeah, let's keep moving. So it's a little syntax about basically making a list of fields that you want to select, and by using either an exclamation mark or a asterisk, you can also expand objects. So I could tell Umbraco to follow a content picker in order to actually get more data. So I can literally expand my query using that. And because I'm running out of time, I'm going to speed this up a little. Next up was the filtering system, which was probably the most interesting one to implement, because there I had to make sure that I could understand operators like the equals, the and, the or, parentheses, that sort of stuff. And this is one of my unit tests that I had for that. And yeah, it did turn out to work really well. So how does this all click together? So at the actual base, there's the matrix API controller, which has a few functions. Two, to get the schema, the full schema, or a schema for just one of the entities. There's an option to get all the filters for a schema, so it knows for employees, for example, that if I hook up 3 types of certifications and I request a list of filters for the employee, it will tell me the possibility for the different type of certifications that you can filter on are the ones that you all have selected as part of an employee. So it does a group call kind of thing. And there's the possibility to list data and get specific data. And when you get schema, it will go to the matrix schema service. The matrix schema service will go to the property converter. And for each type of property editor that we have in Umbraco, and as long as it's supported in the API of the matrix, there is a implementation of the property converter. So for example, we had a block list property converter, a content picker converter, and a text box property converter. And the block list, for example, has nested content kind of things in it. So it's all data that's part of that. But the content picker is an interesting one, because a content picker actually has to be followed, opened by Umbraco, so you can get more of the data. So this one actually had to support something like an expansion. If I go into a content editor and I'm interested in a subfield of a content picker, I had to go back into the matrix schema, go back into the property converter and get all the data that's part of the content picker. So it's a very interesting kind of system. And the same happened for the matrix data service. You go into the generate data. It will then get data from all the property converters, and it will turn me a list of the data that's there. So pretty much we take the data from Umbraco, we convert it into some sort of generic format, and then kick it back to the front end. And while it's doing so, it applies all the filters and the selections that we made so far. So after you've done a query, you'll end up with something like this. So for example, here I requested a entity employee, and I filtered on all where the name equals Lennard Fonteijn, so my own name. And as you can see, it finds a few results, but one of which is my personal profile here and all the data that I'm interested in. So then the question becomes, how did we integrate all of this into the corporate website? And I'm closing up, so please give me a little bit of more time, then I'm done. With the cart row in mind that I showed you in the beginning, we added a matrix component on top of that. And the matrix component is rather simple. It does the query for you. You get a response out of that thing. And then you can remap the data that's in the JSON to one of the 4 fields that are part of the card row. So I could pull out links, descriptions, titles, images, and that sort of thing. And I could tell it how it should link and how it should look like. So we could make it look like a slider. We could make it look like cases. We could make it look like a partnership. There's all kinds of different stylings for this data. But for as far as the component is concerned, it doesn't matter as long as it fits in those 4 fields. Here's an example of how the code would look like as part of the component and how the JSON path works, but I'm just going to skip over that for now. Sorry. We also made a dashboard in Umbraco to allow us to link content to entities in the matrix, which allowed us to make for example, the links from the cases show up in the knowledge base. But it also allowed to render a list of cases, for example, and link them to content pages, even though the matrix itself doesn't really know about anything about content. So it allowed us to make a sort of two-way binding for data. And we also had a high-up dashboard to show all this data. So last but not least, the knowledge base. How does that work? So okay, we have a dynamic matrix, we have a dynamic API, and we have a front end that somewhat knows how things should look like. What about the knowledge base? Well, the power is mostly in the schema. The schema tells us exactly what the page can expect. So when we request the schema, we know all the entities that are part of the API. When you click one of the entities, you can pretty much just render the page because you know, okay, there's a first name, it's of type string, so we want the string to look like this. We have a image, we know it's a media picker, so make it look like an image. So there's all kinds of things that you can make and render as part of the knowledge base. Some of these pages obviously have predetermined templates, so we want a case to look like a case. But there are also situations where we simply do not know how a page looks like, or some new entity that hasn't been designed yet. Then it will just fall back to a default structure and just follow logic. So for example, I opened up a employee role here, and it will just show all the data fields that are part of this and also the related data. So obviously, probably or seemingly, I'm the only CTO that is currently registered in our knowledge base. That was my talk. I was going to ask for questions, but I think I'm fully out of time. So thank you very much. If you have any questions regarding my talk, please just send me an email and I'll happily respond to you.